Unfortunately, some more bad news for Tesla stock. I want to bring this warning to the Tesla stock community here on YouTube because this is not talked at all, basically. And I'll start right here. Ray Dalio, who founded the world's biggest hedge fund, exited Tesla stock position earlier this year. This is old news. This is not what this is really about, but it has to do something with it. Ray Dalio just published this article on LinkedIn called "The Changing World Order is Approaching Stage 6, the War Stage." There's a lot to go through, so we will do a deep dive into this. Ray Dalio says the evidence points to us being on the brink of civil and or international war, and the international one is the one that I'm really worried about. In terms of a civil war in the US, for Tesla stock specifically, I don't think that would be that bad. Then we think about an international war. That would be a lot more worse, I believe. I also need to mention when Ray Dalio sold, or Bridgewater, the hedge fund founded by Ray Dalio, when they sold Tesla stock, they did increase their positions in NIO, Xpeng, and another Chinese automaker. The reason for this could also be explained when there are tensions between countries. The war just does not break out immediately. There are first capital controls, and you just make it very difficult for foreign companies, for example, to operate domestically. So, for example, when tensions go up, we can certainly expect Tesla to pay a very high price if they want to continue operating within China, if we indeed have bad things that start happening, while, of course, Chinese automakers that only operate domestically and they barely export any vehicles, of course, they would enjoy operating without any real hurdle. So it does make sense to then invest into those other companies and not so much into Tesla if you believe that the tensions are increasing and there is going to be a capital war, for example, which almost always comes before the actual war. We will go through the whole thing, but first let's start with some of the most important highlights so you get a better picture of everything, and we will see what is the actual likelihood of things becoming incredibly bad. In terms of wars, there are 5 major kinds of fights between countries. First one is trade economic wars. We already had those with China. Remember our previous president in the US. I shouldn't say our because I live in Canada. So previous US president. There were definitely trade and economic wars with China. Technology wars, we have already seen those with certain apps. And for example, Huawei not allowed in the US, and we now know there's US ban on Americans aiding China chip firms. This is not exactly looking very good. Then capital wars, geopolitical wars, and then military wars. So we are maybe having some signals of those. Of course, we know the island where Taipei is, that is not looking exactly great at the moment. And we still have many Chinese companies listed on the stock exchanges in the US. So you know that US has some serious firepower here, some serious damage that they could do to China. So I would expect to see those first before we would have bad things really starting to happen. And this will be a serious video, so no jokes for this one, because this is something that is extremely important if you are an investor. And if you hold Tesla stock, you will be directly affected if there's anything going on between US and China, because Tesla makes so many cars in Giga Shanghai. That's the biggest factory. And they are expanding that factory as well. And the production is going to keep increasing in China. And at this moment, China is still a very important market for Tesla. So this is incredibly important to understand what are the actual likelihoods of this happening. And if it does happen, how would it happen? Would we see this coming from a long way, or does it happen suddenly? Well, we do know that there are those 5 major kinds of fights, and we do know that generally one these ones happen first before the last one. So these are good indicators. So it shouldn't be overnight. That would be kind of unprecedented looking at the history. And of course, the greatest risk of military war is when both parties have, number one, military powers that are roughly comparable, and number two, irreconcilable and existential differences. Fundamentally, a military power comes from GDP. If you have high GDP, even if your military right now is not very strong, you can build up your military very, very quickly. So I would look at GDP first. That's the number one thing that I would look at. And we can see that China and US are fairly comparable. And if China keeps growing, then of course, this will be, China might surpass US. And therefore, China's military power would eventually become much larger, even though right now, when we compare the militaries, China spends about over $200 billion a year on its military, and US in 2020 was close to 800 billion. So in terms of that and technology and everything, there's no close comparison at this moment, but that can change very quickly. And US has to look and take care of basically the whole world everywhere all at once, while China only needs to worry about one area so it can concentrate its firepower, which is why this is a serious thing to really think about. US doesn't mean it would just win immediately, because US has to look at the whole world and China only its own backyard. So we are going to review how the cycles throughout history work that result in wars, because without understanding how these cycles transpire, you will simply be an observer of events that you will see through the news, and you will be caught by surprise. Whereas if you understand how it all works, you will be ready and you will not be caught off by surprise, and you will do what is needed with your investments to prepare for those as well, because I don't want to lose my money. I am in a way diversified with my real estate and my businesses, and I have strong income, but I only hold Tesla stock in my stock portfolio. So anything to do with Tesla stock, I pay extremely close attention, which is why I'm keeping a very close, I pay very close attention to what could possibly happen and what are the chances. Now, mind you, Ray Dalio is not saying that there will definitely be a war or that it will happen very soon. However, he is saying that different sides in domestic and international conflicts are preparing for war, and if events are allowed to progress as they typically do, which is the typical cycle, you look at the history, this happens over and 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 over again. There's a dangerously high probability of us being in at least one of these wars, if not both, in about 5 years, give or take about 3, with the highest risk point being in 2025 and 26. Now, I personally want to hold my Tesla stock. I intend to hold my Tesla stock until the year of 2030. So that's past the highest risk period. Now, I have some people that I greatly respect who are close to me, and some of them used to tell me that I'm afraid of potential war for no reason. This was before Russia. And I left Europe years ago because I saw what was going on with Russia and Ukraine in 2014. And I looked through history and I did not like what I saw. And I came to a conclusion that I don't think we as humans changed that much, and I would have more reason to believe that these cycles are going to continue like they did before, like they happened before we were on this earth. And it's easy to believe, oh, this will not happen to us because this has never happened to us, while we were alive, even if you are 60 years old. The Second World War, that's a long time ago. So it's natural to think we don't need to worry about this because this has not happened in our lifetimes. And this is where Ray Dalio points out that it's important to understand this, because even though it has not happened in our lifetimes, it has occurred many times before, most recently in 1930s to 1945. Now, a difference right now is, and this is when it comes to investing, saying, oh, this time is different, that's quite dangerous to say. And it is dangerous to say in this case, I believe as well. But Ray Dalio says that the good thing is that the scary realities are now much more broadly recognized than they were a couple of years ago. That's a good thing. Now, the bad thing here is that nothing much is being done to halt their progressions. And this is one great reason why I listen very closely to what Ray Dalio says, because approximately 2.5 years ago, he described this big cycle that we are going to go through. And at that time, many people thought the picture that Ray Dalio painted of a cycle that was leading us toward a financial and economic crisis, which then creates internal conflicts, which would border on a type of a civil war, and then even great external conflicts that could lead to some form of international war. They all said this was implausible and exaggerated. Now that we have seen Russia and Ukraine, I don't think anyone is saying that Ray Dalio is unreasonable or exaggerating here. So this is all based on this big cycle. The big cycle has many cycles. Actually, these are not that many. One of them in the big cycle is the long-term debt money economic cycle. So that's one cycle that consists, that is included in that big cycle. Second one is internal order disorder cycle. So this is when you have, for example, internal disagreements like we see in the US right now. And then number 3, the external order disorder cycle. So this is when a rising power, for example, like China, is challenging US. And just to touch a little bit on here, the long-term debt money economic cycle. This is then countries become extremely indebted, which is where US is sort of heading to. And the big cycle consists of those 3 cycles. And when those 3 other cycles happen basically at the same time, that's when you have this big cycle. Where he says here, when financial problems occur at the same time as large internal and external conflicts over wealth, power, and values, that produces a perfect storm. That's what we do not want. So let's take a look at where are we at within all of those 3 cycles that make up that big cycle. So the long-term debt money economic cycle, most countries, most importantly the major reserve currency countries, are approaching the contraction restructuring stage of this long-term cycle. The contraction restructuring phase occurs when the levels and growth rates of debt are unsustainable in ways and amounts that are similar to the period of 1930s to 1945 and many periods before that. So this happens when debt levels are extremely high, so that new debt is difficult to take on because the amount of interest that someone who would be lending money is too high to pay for the one accepting that debt. And this creates a problem. Ray says here that puts the central bank in a difficult position of having either to allow interest rates to rise due to the selling of debt, which is depressing to asset prices and the economy, which we have seen what happened today to the markets. The markets tanked completely. Tesla stock is down almost 6%. S&P 500, NASDAQ, multiple percent the market here. You can see NASDAQ down over 3%. This is a big swing in just one single day. This is what interest rates do. So that is depressing to asset price and the economy. The other option is to print a lot of money and buy the debts, which depreciates the value of money. So basically extreme inflation. And most countries, by the way, they choose to print money. For example, in Europe, they're not really raising interest rates. Japan, they have been printing money for so many years. And US is in a more of a unique position because it has the world's reserve currency. And well, that's better for US, and hopefully they can keep increasing those rates without completely crashing the market. But nevertheless, that puts us at more towards the end of that cycle because USA debt is extremely high, and most governments will keep spending more than how much they collect in tax revenue, and therefore US will need to raise money and sell debt, which is projected to be, based on Dalio, about 5% of GDP in per year. That's a lot. And if you want to dig into the details here, it's actually going to be 10%. I don't want to make this video multiple hours, so we're going to continue. So that's the economic cycle. And then we got the long-term internal order disorder cycle. So this is most countries in varying degrees, especially most Western democracies and most, especially the United States, are now approaching the dangerous internal conflict part of a cycle, which is primarily due to the largest wealth, values, and political differences since the 1930 period. And here's the thing. Basically, in the US, no one agrees on anything anymore. And you can clearly see that. And the thing is, our leaders show no prospect of figuring these things out in a way that will satisfy most Americans. This is not good. And moderates are basically replaced by extremists, which one thing that gives me hope. Elon Musk is a moderate, and it appears that both sides on the extremes are very upset at Elon Musk right now, which I believe is a good sign. So I do have hope that maybe things will get better. And then the third cycle that that makes up that big cycle is the long-term order disorder external cycle. This is then a rising power challenges an existing power. So China challenging US as an example. And one thing that I would like to point out, those who are not familiar with Chinese history, they will point out that China never invades other countries. But what they miss is that the reason for that oftentimes is because they are fighting inside of China. You see, China is not exactly that unified as you might think it is. Throughout history, it falls into pieces, and there's non-stop fighting. It's basically a non-stop civil war. The way to think about it is, then we think of World War I and World War II. That's mostly basically just Europe fighting with itself. You could call that a European civil war. I wouldn't call it, because I would say there are many countries in Europe. China has a population that is bigger of all of Europe. So, you know, when you hear someone saying, oh, China never invades another country, think more about that. And right now, by the way, China is unified pretty well. So why do you think they will not, go outside? So these are the stages. Pause the video if you'd like to read those. I don't want to make this video too long. Ray is saying that he's not saying a war will happen, but he is saying that whether or not these wars happen is now too close to call. Of course, during wars, asset freezes and seizures, they are not rare. In times of war, all economies become command economies, de facto run by their governments rather than run independently in pursuit of profits. For example, many countries simply closed their stock markets, meaning many people couldn't access their savings held in equities at all, which is one reason why I like real estate. So how did investors fare through this turmoil when wars happen? 7 of the 10 countries saw wealth virtually wiped out at least once, and even the countries that didn't see wealth wiped out had a handful of terrible decades for asset returns that essentially destroyed them financially. Yeah, you don't want to see minus 100 in your return spreadsheet. What would happen to Tesla stock if the worst happens? I made a video why Tesla stock would be okay in a global conflict. Click on that right now. My name is Matt Postius, and I'll see you later tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching.